The first notes from the string quartet unspooled like silk in the air, and the grand ballroom of the Waldorf glowed the way a heart glows when it knows it's being watched. Light poured from chandeliers in soft halos, gilding faces, catching at glassware, turning the polished floor into a river of hush and shimmer. New York in early spring always carries a private promise, of fragile blossoms on stone, of warmth wrapped in weathered grit, and tonight that promise had assembled itself beneath one ceiling. Patrons, artists, city council members, old money matrons who still held their gloves when they laughed, young founders with nervous smiles. Every one of them gathered for the Children's Arts Foundation Gala. Naomi Brooks let the music breathe through her before she took a step. The hem of her ivory gown skimmed the floor like a tide choosing where to turn, and the pearls at her throat, small, luminous, not the kind that shout, rested against her skin as if they belonged there. She had chosen them for their restraint, for the way they let the woman be the jewel. Naomi believed in such principles, that beauty should suggest rather than insist, that goodness should be quiet and dazzling in the same breath, that a room will always recognize the one who built it. She had built this night. Not only the seating chart and the speaker run of show, though both were a choreography of power and tact, she had built the impulse itself, the irresistible pull to give. For months she had sat with superintendents and principals from boroughs too often named only when something breaks. She had listened to a violinist from the Bronx who practiced scales in a kitchen while his mother worked double shifts, to a painter in Queens who mixed color between homework problems, to a dancer in Harlem who knew gravity was a rumor. How could the city not help such children say yes to themselves? Naomi had simply stitched the yes into a gala, threaded with purpose, trimmed in grace, and the city had come. If Naomi was the current, she was also the shore, poised, steady, attentive. A dozen people came toward her as she crossed the foyer, and she greeted each one as though the conversation were a small bouquet meant for two hands. Her smile didn't perform, it welcomed. Her laugh didn't ring, it warmed. She moved the way trust moves through a room, quietly, binding, without haste. "Dr. Brooks, the governor's liaison is at table 4, whispered a coordinator, touchboard held like a shield of light. "And the poet you invited is here, early. She wanted to meet you." Naomi smiled, that tender habit of hers that lifted her whole face. "Early poets are blessings. Please bring her to the green room. I have something for her." The coordinator vanished. Naomi paused near a marble column where light pooled, and for a breath, she let herself remember what it had cost to become a woman who could command this room with tenderness instead of thunder. There had been years when her name lived in fine print under other people's victories, years when she translated brilliance for men who forgot to look up, years when she taught herself to fold her power into a lantern and carry it through weather. She had not lost those years. She had refined them into this, a night that would send violins and brushes and bodies into flight. "Naomi." The voice arrived softly from her left, belonging to a museum director with eyes like winter beaches. "You've outdone yourself. This is luminous." "Thank you." Naomi's hand rested briefly on the woman's arm, an unspoken promise that generosity would be seen and remembered. "Tonight we'll make sure light has a budget." They laughed, and then the orchestra swelled, and then the doors to the ballroom opened wider. The guests began to flow in, sequins and satin, suits and shy glances, the hush of expectation rising like steam from a feast. Naomi stood for a moment at the threshold, the world behind her and the stage ahead. The chandelier nearest the dais held 1,000 small suns. Their reflections trembled in her eyes. Somewhere, a watch was being checked. Somewhere, a donor rehearsed an anecdote intended to sound spontaneous. Somewhere, a teenager in a fifth-floor walk-up tuned a borrowed violin and didn't know that, within the hour, the city would be tuning itself to the music already living in his hands. Naomi inhaled. She could taste the evening, citrus and candle wax, a nervous hint of cologne, the faint metallic brightness of polished silver in the back of her throat. She let it sit there, a benediction. Tonight she would introduce a teacher who had taught a generation to draw courage in color. Tonight she would read a letter from a child who wrote, in a cramped, careful script, Art gave me friends when I had none. Tonight she would watch the governor's liaison wipe away a quick tear and pretend it was a laugh. In the far mirror, the room appeared as a version of itself, slightly enchanted. Naomi saw herself there, doubled, and in that tender distortion, she felt the old ache and the new armor. The ache of hours poured into others' dreams, the armor of a woman who now tends her own. For an instant she closed her eyes, and a memory crossed the dark. Ethan on a rainy Seattle street, hair pasted to his forehead, his hands moving as fast as his ideas. He had looked at her then as people look at shelter. She had offered it gladly. Love, too, was a kind of philanthropy. What you grant, what you endow, the futures you underwrite. But even endowments require stewardship. Even love asks for the dignity of being accounted for. Dr. Brooks? A young usher hovered, breathless but trying not to be. We're ready for pre-show in the green room. Of course. Naomi touched the edge of her program, a reflex like a pianist testing a single note. She turned toward the hallway, and the silk at her ankles whispered in agreement. As she passed the table where the evening's centerpiece was quietly flamboyant, branches bearing paper birds folded by students across the city, Naomi reached out and set one small crane a fraction straighter, as if its journey might depend on a truer angle. She didn't believe in omens, not exactly. She believed in care. She reached the green room at the same moment the poet did, a slight woman with a storm for a mind. Naomi offered her a wrapped journal. For the lines that arrive uninvited, she said. The poet smiled in that way poets do when language recognizes kin. Will you read tonight, Dr. Brooks? The poet asked. Your invitations read like hymns. Only a welcome, Naomi replied. A door held open. The poet nodded, as if that were its own kind of poem. Back in the wings, Naomi looked through the narrow slit between curtain and world. The ballroom had settled into its attentive shimmer, a soft chorus of anticipation. She felt the old performance nerves lift and dissolve into something purer. Not nerves, devotion. She would not be performing herself tonight. She would be performing a city's promise. The MC's voice found its pitch. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, please take your seats. In a moment, we'll begin. Naomi closed the slit, pressed her palms together, and bowed her head, once, briefly, to the private altar of work well done. She lifted her chin and walked toward the light. And if, in this first breath of the night, you feel the same quiet ache and widening hope that she carries, if you believe art makes room where none existed before, stay with her. Tell her, in a line below, what art once rescued in you. Offer your presence with a gentle tap on like, a word in the comments, a promise to return. Stories, like foundations, live on the hands that hold them. Tonight, let's hold this one together. There are certain moments that do not announce themselves as beginnings. They slip quietly into the calendar, disguised as ordinary days, until years later you look back and realize the entire architecture of your life was born from that single, unremarkable hour. For Naomi Brooks, that hour arrived one rainy afternoon in Seattle. She had been the keynote moderator at a technology and culture summit, an unlikely pairing that sought to merge innovation with humanism. Outside, the sky hung low, pewter and generous with its rain. Inside, the room hummed with caffeine and ambition. Naomi moved among the clusters of attendees with the easy grace of someone both observing and belonging, her notebook pressed against her chest, her thoughts as ordered as the lines of the blazer she wore. That was when she heard a voice, hesitant but alive with conviction. I think empathy is the missing code. She turned. A man stood at the edge of a discussion group, tall in a way that seemed slightly apologetic, as though he was still learning how to occupy his own frame. His sandy hair was damp from the rain, his glasses fogged slightly. But there was something in the way he spoke, an unpolished sincerity that made people lean in. His name was Ethan Collins, a software engineer whose startup, at the time, existed mostly as a dream crammed into a second-hand laptop and a rented basement office. He believed that technology could learn to listen, that algorithms could be taught to understand not just behavior, but emotion. It sounded naive to some, revolutionary to others. To Naomi, it sounded like music. Later, Over coffee that tasted faintly of citrus and rainwater, he confessed, almost shyly, "I know how to build the machinery, but not how to make people believe in it." Naomi smiled, stirring her drink slowly. "Then you don't have a code problem," she said. "You have a story problem. And stories," she added, "are my language." She was working then as a communications strategist for a global nonprofit, building narratives that turned abstract data into something people could feel. Her instinct for design was matched only by her precision with words. Where others saw statistics, she saw human texture. Where others built campaigns, she built conviction. Ethan asked if she might look at his investor pitch deck. She did. By the next morning, she had rewritten half of it. Within a week, she had redesigned his company's identity, written a manifesto, and introduced him to 3 people who would later become his earliest backers. When he thanked her, she brushed it off lightly, though privately, she was already invested. Less in the company, more in the idea of someone who dreamed out loud but listened when she spoke. Their partnership began as collaboration and unfolded, as such things often do, into something quieter and far more consuming. Ethan brought her into his world of restless creation. She brought him the language of grace. Together they learned that building something lasting, whether a company or a relationship, required both architecture and art. The early years were lean but luminous. Their first office had cracked windows and mismatched furniture. Naomi brought in a lamp that threw honeyed light across the peeling walls, insisting that vision deserves atmosphere. She wrote taglines on napkins, drafted press releases between bites of takeout noodles, and built a brand identity with the precision of a sculptor who already saw the marble's final form. Ethan used to watch her when she wasn't looking, how she organized chaos into harmony, how she made even exhaustion seem elegant. Once, after a long night of revisions, he said, "You make the hard parts look like choreography." Naomi laughed softly. "That's because I choreographed them." They married 2 years later on a hill above Lake Washington, where the water mirrored a sky filled with forgiving clouds. There were only 20 guests, friends, family, a few investors who had become more like believers. The ceremony was simple, but when Naomi walked toward him and addressed the color of possibility, Ethan felt a kind of awe that no metric could measure. "I can't promise perfection," he whispered as he slipped the ring onto her finger, "but I can promise the trying." She smiled. "Then we're even." Their new life was a collage of ambition and tenderness. By day they chased contracts, refined code, built networks. By night they cooked together, argued about fonts and futures, dreamed of the company they would one day build to scale. Ethan's startup, soon to be called Syntrax Systems, grew steadily, powered by his innovation and her vision. Investors loved his intellect but trusted her presence. She spoke the language of boardrooms and classrooms alike. She understood that influence wasn't merely won, it was designed. Years passed in a golden blur. The basement office became a glass-walled headquarters overlooking Elliott Bay. The cracked coffee mugs gave way to minimalist ceramics. The nights of instant noodles turned into dinners lit by candle and conversation. Yet even as their surroundings shifted, Naomi kept one ritual unchanged. On the first day of every new project, she placed fresh white flowers on her desk. "To remind the work it's meant to live," she would say. But success, as she would learn, has its own gravity. It lifts and it separates. As Syntrax expanded across continents, Ethan's days grew longer, his presence shorter. Conferences became constant. Phone calls replaced breakfasts. Silence crept in, polite but persistent. Naomi adapted, because she always had. She filled her calendar with foundation work, mentoring programs for young Black women entering tech, partnerships that reminded her she was still shaping stories that mattered. Yet some evenings, standing by their apartment window, she felt a loneliness that didn't ache so much as hum, a background frequency in the life she had built. Once she mentioned it lightly. "Do you ever miss when everything felt small enough to hold?" she asked. Ethan, scrolling through his phone, murmured, "Small things don't scale." It was a practical answer. It was also the first time she wondered if their hearts were built on different operating systems. Still, she stayed the architect of his image, their brand, their life. She designed their New York apartment when the company relocated, filling it with quiet tones and open light. the kind of beauty that breathes. She believed elegance wasn't about money, but about meaning. The way space could hold peace, the way silence could be kind. Guests who visited always remarked how calm everything felt. They didn't see the blueprints behind it, the invisible labor of harmony. And so, from the outside, it looked perfect. A couple who had built an empire together, respected in their fields, admired in their city. But inside, beneath the polish and the panoramic view, Naomi began to feel what every architect eventually learns. The foundation that once held weight can, without warning, begin to shift. She would not realize how far it had already moved until the night of the gala, when light would break against her like a question she already knew the answer to. For now, though, she stood before that view, watching the city flicker below, unaware that the life she had built so carefully was beginning, imperceptibly, to lean. The years that followed were the kind that shimmer in memory, years people later point to and say, that's when everything turned golden. For Naomi and Ethan, it was the era of champagne toasts, magazine profiles, and small victories strung together like pearls. Syntrax Systems had gone from a startup housed in a basement to a multinational enterprise whose software pulsed quietly through the infrastructure of major corporations. Its interface, the one Naomi had designed and refined through countless sleepless nights, became a benchmark of clarity and trust. Ethan's name began appearing in articles beside words like visionary and disruptor. Venture capitalists quoted him, journalists adored him, and invitations from universities and global forums flooded their inbox. And wherever Ethan went, Naomi followed, though not always in person. She appeared in the background of photographs, her smile elegant, her presence refined. At every conference dinner, she knew precisely when to speak and when to let silence make her powerful. When journalists asked about her husband's success, she said, "He's building something extraordinary. I'm proud to be a part of it." She was more than a part of it. She was the architecture that allowed it to exist. Yet somewhere between the standing ovations and the champagne flutes, Naomi began to feel a subtle displacement, a slow and almost imperceptible migration from center to edge. It wasn't a rupture, it was drift. And drift, she would later realize, is the most dangerous form of loss because it disguises itself as stability. Their move to New York was the first marker of that change. The city's rhythm matched Ethan's new appetite for magnitude, its restless skyline, its constant performance of ambition. They purchased a penthouse in Tribeca, a space all glass and breath, where the city's lights looked close enough to touch. Naomi made it a home. She softened the edges of its modern lines with textures that whispered of life. Linen curtains that moved with the wind, reclaimed wood that remembered warmth, paintings by young artists whose work spoke of becoming. Every object carried intention. Every corner told a story. She didn't believe in grandeur. She believed in presence. Ethan believed in expansion. He rose earlier now, often before dawn, his voice echoing through conference calls while the sky was still the color of sleep. He flew to London, to Singapore, to Sao Paulo, cities where Naomi's touch existed only in his luggage tags and press materials. When he returned, he brought gifts that were always exquisite and always impersonal. Silk scarves, rare teas, watches she didn't need. The gestures of a man trying to prove he remembered. She smiled and thanked him, though what she wanted wasn't a gift. It was a moment of seeing. At dinners, she still held court effortlessly. Their friends admired how seamlessly she navigated conversation, how she turned social gatherings into art. They saw a woman completely at ease in the shimmering orbit of her husband's success. But Naomi saw the patterns, the ones no one else noticed. How Ethan's anecdotes no longer began with "we." How journalists stopped including her name in features about Syntrax's origins. How people looked past her at galas, seeking the man they assumed held the light. And yet, she never protested. She believed still in the equilibrium of their early years. She believed he knew her worth because he had built his world on it. It's easy to forget when you're building empires that foundations do not ask to be remembered until they begin to crack. The cracks began in whispers. Ethan would mention new colleagues, strategists, advisors, consultants. He praised them with the casual enthusiasm of a man trying to prove his company's evolution. "She's brilliant with data models," he'd say, or "He's a genius with behavioral analytics." Naomi nodded, genuinely curious. She had always been proud of his hunger for ideas. But one evening, while she waited for him to return from a late dinner, her phone buzzed with a news alert. A photograph of Ethan at a gala in London. He was laughing beside a group of investors and, just beside him, a young woman in a red dress, her hand on his arm. Her gaze turned toward him with the easy intimacy of someone who had forgotten cameras existed. Naomi studied the image for a long moment. It was harmless, she told herself. Optics. Perception. She knew that world too well to mistake appearance for fact. Still, something in her chest shifted, a slow tilt, like a painting that has hung straight for years and suddenly begins to lean. When Ethan returned 3 days later, she said nothing. He was tired, distracted, gentle in the way that guilty men often are. He kissed her forehead and said, "You wouldn't believe the deals we closed." She smiled, because smiling was part of the design. To everyone else, they remained the perfect couple, the embodiment of ambition wrapped in grace. They were photographed for business magazines, invited to host panels on innovation and philanthropy. Naomi was quoted as the voice of elegance in a world obsessed with disruption. The irony didn't escape her. Sometimes, during interviews, she caught Ethan watching her. There was admiration in his gaze still, but it was distant, like someone watching a constellation they used to navigate by, but no longer needed to find their way. At night, when he fell asleep before her, she would lie awake and listen to the rhythm of his breathing, the sound that had once been the measure of home. It used to calm her. Now it only made her aware of the spaces between breaths. The gala season approached again. Naomi threw herself into her work with the Children's Arts Foundation, planning their next fundraising event. It was a project that had started as a side passion, but had become her sanctuary, a place where purpose still felt pure, untouched by ego. She designed everything: the theme, the decor, the performances. The night would celebrate the transformative power of creativity for underprivileged youth across New York. In each meeting, in every detail, she rediscovered fragments of herself. The woman who believed art could reorder the world's heartbeats. Meanwhile, Ethan was building something else: investors, partnerships, a reputation that no longer required hers. When he mentioned his new brand consultant, his tone was offhand, but Naomi felt the air tighten. She asked lightly, "Is she the one from the London trip?" He hesitated just a fraction too long. "Yes, Lena. She's talented, brings a fresh perspective." "Of course," Naomi said, the way one acknowledges the weather. Something inevitable, beyond negotiation. Later that night, as she reviewed the guest list for the foundation gala, she added a note beside one name. Ethan Collins, +1. Guest, Lena Hart. Her pen didn't shake. She simply underlined the word guest twice, neatly, as if precision could protect her from pain. She didn't know yet that this would be the line dividing before and after, the quiet hinge on which her entire story would turn. For now, Naomi believed she was still building something together. She didn't realize she was already standing alone in the house she had designed. It began, as most undoings do, with something small. So small, in fact, that Naomi almost convinced herself she imagined it. A missed flight, a message unanswered, a tone of distance wrapped in practiced warmth. The sort of moments that slip through a day like smoke and leave the faintest trace of something burning underneath. Ethan had been traveling constantly that spring. Berlin for an investors' forum, then San Francisco for a product launch, then London again. Naomi had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his absence. They spoke through brief phone calls at night, each voice softened by time zones and fatigue. He always sounded just out of reach, as if speaking from the edge of another life. But that Tuesday evening, the one that would settle like glass in her memory, Naomi wasn't looking for cracks. She was finishing a proposal for the foundation's new literacy program, her notes spread across the kitchen island, a cup of peppermint tea cooling beside her. The city outside pulsed faintly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, yellow taxis sliding along wet asphalt, lights rising like constellations from the river. Ethan's tablet lay open nearby, forgotten after he'd rushed to the airport that morning. Normally she would have ignored it, Boundaries were a discipline she practiced like prayer, but she needed his flight details for the board meeting she was arranging for Friday. She wanted to confirm what time he'd land. She reached for the tablet. Its screen, when touched, came to life instantly. No password prompt, no hesitation. A single notification glowed against the dark wallpaper. Can't wait to see you again. Last night was perfect. Naomi froze. For a long moment, she did not breathe. Her first instinct wasn't suspicion. It was disbelief, the mind's gentle rebellion against sudden truth. Then she tapped the notification, and the world unfolded with the calm cruelty of evidence. The message thread was brief, but it was enough. Laughter in words, familiarity dressed as affection, and a photograph, Ethan in a hotel lounge, his smile unguarded, a woman's hand resting lightly on his arm. She had the kind of beauty that made rooms lean toward her. Dark hair, clear eyes, a youth untouched by effort. The caption below the image read simply, "Dinner with my favorite thinker." Naomi's thumb hovered above the screen before she set it down, slowly, as though returning something fragile to the earth. The silence of the apartment pressed in. She looked around, the vase of tulips on the counter, the soft throw she'd chosen to match the pale gray sofa, the stillness of a life curated to feel invulnerable. How strange that everything could remain so intact when the air had just shifted forever. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her body entered the stillness that comes just before a storm decides whether it will break. She moved through the apartment on instinct, her steps soundless on the hardwood floor. In the bedroom, the bed lay made, crisp, waiting. His suitcase was gone, his scent faint on the pillow. She stood there for a while, her reflection watching her from the mirror across the room. A composed silhouette of grace, even in shock. It wasn't rage that filled her. It was something colder, cleaner, precision. She sat at her desk and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, she wrote a date. Beneath it, Flight 237, New York to London, Tuesday morning. Then, message received, 7:42 p.m. Her pen moved with deliberate calm. It was not an act of obsession, but of restoration, an attempt to reclaim agency where trust had been erased. She had built an empire from nothing once before. She could build clarity now from betrayal. When she finally slept, just before dawn, she dreamed of glass breaking in water. Soundless, slow, impossibly beautiful. In the days that followed, Naomi lived as though nothing had changed. She chaired meetings, approved budgets, smiled at donors. She laughed when laughter was expected. Only in the quiet spaces between appointments did she allow her mind to replay what she had seen. Ethan called each night from London, his voice affectionate, almost eager. He told her about meetings, about jet lag, about missing home. She listened, answering with practiced gentleness, taking mental notes of the lies disguised as logistics. She was not ready to confront him, not yet. Emotion, she knew, was an unreliable witness. Information, on the other hand, held. When he returned, he brought her a small gift, a scarf of Italian silk in pale blue. "Reminded me of you," he said, his smile easy. Naomi let the fabric glide between her fingers. "Beautiful," she murmured. It was. So were weapons when forged correctly. The woman's name came to her 2 weeks later. Lena Hart, a consultant, 28. Naomi learned this not by chance but by design. Her world ran on networks, people who owed her quiet favors, assistants who spoke softly, journalists who remembered kindness. The information arrived with a matter-of-factness that made betrayal feel bureaucratic. Naomi read the details one evening with a glass of wine untouched beside her. Lena was clever, ambitious, adept at self-presentation. Her social media accounts were a curated mosaic of conferences, rooftop cocktails, and captions about empowerment. She looked like someone who believed proximity to brilliance could make her incandescent. Naomi closed her laptop. For a long while she sat in the half-light, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the small mechanical persistence of ordinary life. How easily the extraordinary becomes routine, how quietly love can evolve into oversight. She thought of Ethan's early years, the basement office, the lamp she'd brought to soften the light, the way he used to look at her as though she were the compass by which he navigated the world. When had admiration turned to assumption? When had partnership become backdrop? She could not trace it to a single moment. It had been gradual, like erosion, one grain of sand at a time, until the shoreline no longer resembled itself. A week later, Naomi hosted a small dinner for the foundation's executive board. The evening was warm, the kind of April night that makes even the city exhale. As guests mingled, she caught herself glancing toward the door more than once, listening for Ethan's key. He arrived late, his apology charming, his smile flawless. And as he bent to kiss her cheek, she smelled a perfume that wasn't hers. Light, floral, deliberate. For an instant, she imagined the confrontation, the sharp clarity of truth spoken aloud, the storm of explanation that would follow. But she said nothing. She smiled, welcomed him, guided him toward the guests. Her silence was not surrender. It was preparation. She watched him across the room as he told a story, laughter spilling effortlessly around him. How easily charisma masquerades as character. How easily women are taught to forgive in advance. That night, when the last glass was cleared and the city had gone to sleep, Naomi stood by the window. Her reflection doubled against the skyline. She no longer felt shock. What replaced it was sharper, awareness honed to a blade. She whispered to the empty room, not as vow, but as observation. So this is the beginning. The words lingered in the air, gentle but irrevocable. The hairline crack had formed, invisible to anyone but her. And though she could not yet see how far it would run, she knew this. Once a fracture begins, the structure never forgets where it started. In the quiet that follows revelation, some hearts barrel toward thunder. Naomi's did not. It lowered itself into a steadying hush, as if a cathedral had been built inside her chest overnight. She learned the new acoustics of herself, how grief sounded softened by discipline, how anger became a clean line when traced by purpose. She would not shatter. She would measure. She began with the banal, the reliable ledger of modern life, email confirmations, calendar logs, expense reports that listed dinners as strategy touchpoints and hotels as overnight offsites. She did not hack or hunt. She read the world that had already announced itself. Ethan's travel app yielded timestamps. His rideshare receipts assembled a choreography of neighborhoods and hours. She printed nothing. She photographed everything, storing it under innocuous file names. Orchid, Lamplight, Tide, in a folder that lived behind a password only she knew. Names surfaced in the data like shells at low tide. She circled Lena's first, but she did not underline it. The point was not the woman, it was the weather pattern. She traced the arcs of absence that had been justified as opportunity, followed the trail of per diems and client entertainment into evenings that lasted well beyond business. Every detail was a bead. She strung them into a strand. When the floorboards of certainty creak, some people call friends for the comfort of witness. Naomi called a bookkeeper. Mara worked with the foundation, meticulous, discreet, possessed of the kind of mind that noticed when numbers tried to charm. Over tea in a cafe with steamed windows and good cinnamon, Naomi spoke without ornament. "I need you to reconcile some dates across accounts," she said, quietly. "If anything feels anomalous, flag it as an educational exercise." Mara nodded, the pact of women who understand what must be named without saying why. By end of week, a spreadsheet appeared in Naomi's inbox. Columns of dates, vendors, currencies, the occasional annotation. Duplicate entry? Unusual sequence. Data did not accuse, it suggested. It kept suggesting. She moved from numbers to narrative. Public photographs, private itineraries, the London Gala, a rooftop in Soma, a conference in Lisbon where Ethan's panel ended at 4, and his dinner reservation began, curiously, at 10 for 2. She was careful not to be carried by story. She let chronology be the author. Where she felt fury rising to draft a flourish, she replaced it with a footnote. At night, when the city cooled and the river collected lights, she allowed herself precise grief. Not a storm, but a weather system. Moving, temperate, acknowledged. She stood barefoot on the kitchen tile and remembered the first time Ethan had called her home, in that basement office with the honeyed lamp. She refused to revise their past to justify the present. Love had lived there. It had done its work. Now it was time for a different labor. In the mornings, she returned to the children. The foundation meetings steadied her more than sleep. A violinist from Brownsville needed a new bow. A middle school theater program in Elmhurst had outgrown its stage. A teaching artist in the South Bronx was piloting a curriculum where math met mosaic. Naomi approved grants with a tenderness sharpened by resolve. The world did not pause simply because hers was recalculating its route. Still, some afternoons the apartment filled with echoes, the kind that come from an object set down and not picked back up. She refused to be haunted by them. She arranged her desk like a field surgeon. Binder clips, sticky flags, a pen that did not smudge. Evidence went into folders with names no one would think to open. Linen, staircase, waltz. Her order was not obsession, but mercy, for the woman she would be when this chapter required her testimony. The first person she told was Carmen Alvarez. Not the particulars, just the shape. They met at a gallery on the Lower East Side, where the walls held paintings that looked like weather before it decided to rain. Carmen, with her clipped curls and quick eyes, listened and did not flinch. "What do you need?" she asked. "Clarity," Naomi said, "and a lawyer whose work feels like velvet on the throat and steel in the spine." Carmen's smile was a line of understanding. "Danielle Pierce," she answered, as if she had been waiting to say the name. "She believes in paper and in women." They met in an office that looked like the inside of a good argument. Clean, bright, everything placed for utility. Danielle shook Naomi's hand as though the outcome had already agreed to arrive. Naomi did not ask for vengeance. She asked for inventory. They went through the documents the way cartographers draw coastlines. Careful, specific, true. Danielle did not wince at romance's autopsy. She spoke in verbs that held dignity. Establish, assert, protect. When they reached a gap, Naomi did not fill it with speculation. She left it white, a space for fact to enter. "You've built a formidable record," Danielle said at last, closing the folder called Staircase. "You're prepared to be believed." Naomi exhaled. The body knows when it is being defended. "Two things," Danielle continued, calm as a physician. "One, don't confront him yet. Not until your interior is as ordered as these pages. Two, keep being excellent. Judges, journalists, and the world read excellence like truth." Naomi left with no more drama than she'd brought in. She stopped at a florist and bought a single stem of white stock, the scent spicy and clean, and set it on her desk at home. The gesture wasn't symbolic. It was domestic. Life deserved its ordinary beauty, even while it rearranged itself. She added one more practice to her days. She wrote, not to chronicle injury, but to anchor self. 3 pages each morning, longhand, the way you warm a voice before you sing. She wrote about the color of the East River at 7, about a girl in a yellow coat skipping across Houston Street, about the hush in a rehearsal room on 125th when the dancers listened for the downbeat. She wrote about courage as a habit, not an event. Ethan remained considerate, the way absent men often are. He sent photos from airports, brief texts that felt like receipts for tenderness. Some nights he slept beside her, with the relaxed innocence of a boy who believes the lights will always turn on when he flips the switch. She watched him with a sadness uncluttered by cruelty. She did not hate him. She had no room left for the extravagance of hatred. Instead, she curated proof and quiet. She built strength like muscle, incremental, disciplined, invisible until lifted. She rehearsed her voice in the mirror until it could hold both softness and law. She said her full name aloud, Naomi Brooks, and listened as it settled into the room with the authority of its own weather. When the email arrived, the one confirming 2 tickets to the Foundation Gala under Ethan Collins plus Hart, she did not flinch. She took a single breath and opened a new folder. She titled it Threshold. Into it she placed the confirmation, the seating chart, a copy of her speech. Then she closed her laptop, stood, and walked through the apartment, touching objects as if taking their temperatures. The lamp from the basement years, the first photograph they'd taken in New York, the bowl that held her keys. She was not saying goodbye. She was acquainting her hands with what mattered. On her way to bed, she paused at the window. Below, the city glittered with its ordinary audacity, an organism made of a million insistences to keep going. Naomi pressed her forehead to the glass. The cool steadied her. She could feel, deep within, a hinge preparing to bear weight. When she slept, she dreamed not of breaking, but of doors, some closing with the civility of a ballroom curtain, others opening to rooms she had designed, long before she knew she would need them. In the morning, she woke without panic. The truth had stopped arriving like a wave. It now lay before her like coastline. The crack had lengthened, yes, but so had she. There are moments in a life when silence grows so vast it begins to echo. Naomi felt it everywhere, in the still air of the apartment, in the long pauses of conversations that used to flow like light. The silence wasn't absence anymore. It was presence, something thick and deliberate, a thing with shape and pulse. It waited beside her coffee cup each morning, followed her into meetings, brushed its fingers along the edges of her composure as if testing where it might give. Ethan had returned from another conference, his tan faint and uneven, his mood conspicuously bright. He spoke too quickly, complimented too easily. He told stories that sounded rehearsed, like speeches meant to fill space rather than share truth. Naomi listened with the serene patience of a woman observing a performance she had already seen in rehearsal. When he mentioned that the gala, the one she had been preparing for 6 months, would be great exposure for Syntrac's new outreach campaign, she nearly smiled. Exposure. That word had acquired a new edge. "There's someone I'd like to bring," he added casually, pouring himself coffee. "You might have met her at the London event. Lena Hart. She's been helping us with our branding initiatives." Naomi stirred her tea, slow and silent. The spoon touched porcelain with a faint ring, the sound small but final. She looked up at him and said simply, "Of course." That was all. He nodded, relieved by her composure, mistaking restraint for approval. He leaned down to kiss her forehead, and she let him, her expression tender but unreadable. Inside, something had already shifted. A hinge long rusted by denial had turned at last. For 12 hours after that conversation, Naomi did nothing extraordinary. She approved budgets. She answered emails. She hosted a strategy meeting for the foundation's board. Her laughter came easily when it was expected, her tone graceful, measured, warm. But beneath the seamless surface of her day, a current had begun to run. It was quiet and absolute. She had spent months gathering proof, piecing together the mosaic of his betrayal, until the picture no longer changed, only clarified. There was nothing left to discover. The next act would not be about knowledge. It would be about will. She returned home that evening to a sky bruised with early summer clouds. The city shimmered below, unaware that its light mirrored her resolve. She poured a glass of white wine, opened the folder marked Threshold, and looked again at the evidence. Each file, each photo, each note written in her neat hand. Then she closed the laptop and stood by the window. She thought of her mother, a teacher who had once told her that strength wasn't about winning, but about not shrinking. She thought of her grandmother, who had survived the march from Mississippi to Chicago with a baby on her hip and a song still in her throat. The women before her had endured so much less luxury and far more truth. They had built from the ground up without permission. And somewhere along the way, Naomi had mistaken elegance for endurance. That mistake ended tonight. The next morning, she rose before dawn. The air was silver and clean, the kind of morning that asks for decisions. She brewed coffee, dressed in soft gray, and opened her notebook. On one page, she wrote 3 words in black ink: dignity, direction, departure. They weren't a plan, they were a compass. At 8, she called Danielle Pierce. The lawyer's voice came through steady, low, professional. "You're ready," Danielle said, as if reading her silence. "Yes," Naomi replied, "completely." Danielle outlined the steps, the filings, the timing, the strategy to ensure discretion until the moment discretion was no longer necessary. Naomi listened, her tone even. When they hung up, she felt no tremor, only the cool steadiness that precedes clarity. The following week, Ethan traveled again. Naomi used the space he left behind not for mourning, but for choreography. She met with the foundation's event planners, finalizing every detail of the gala. She confirmed catering, arranged the press coverage, and rehearsed her speech. Every decision bore precision. The floral arrangements would be magnolias and orchids, symbols of resilience and rebirth. The color palette, ivory and gold. The event theme, legacy that lasts. She smiled faintly at that. How perfectly ironic that she had designed her own stage for transformation. In the evenings, she walked through Central Park until her thoughts settled into rhythm. The city in summer held the scent of rain and promise. And Naomi began to feel something almost unfamiliar. Anticipation. Not of vengeance, but of arrival. By the time Ethan returned, she had become unreadable in her serenity. He mistook it, as always, for peace. He had no idea that the woman setting the table before him, pouring his wine, asking about his day, was already miles beyond him, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. The night before the gala, Naomi sat alone at her vanity. The apartment was hushed except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of curtains in the wind. Her gown hung beside her, midnight silk, its lines fluid and exact. She traced the fabric with her fingers, appreciating its texture, its silence. She did not feel fear. She felt completion. It wasn't that she had stopped loving him entirely. Love rarely evaporates. It recedes, leaving its shape behind like a tide mark on sand. What she felt now was gratitude for the clarity he had unknowingly given her. For years, she had built her life around the idea that partnership meant patience, that faithfulness meant forgiveness in advance. But standing there, in the golden quiet of her own home, she realized she had mistaken loyalty for surrender. Ethan had taken her grace for granted because she had allowed it to be invisible. That invisibility would end tomorrow. The next morning dawned clear, the air washed by a night of rain. Naomi woke early, her thoughts as calm as water. She moved through her routines as if performing a sacred ritual. Shower, moisturizer, a touch of perfume that smelled of jasmine and salt air. She applied her makeup with a steady hand, her reflection returning her gaze with quiet approval. As she fastened her earrings, simple gold hoops her grandmother once wore, she whispered softly to her reflection, "I see you." There was power in that acknowledgement, not the kind that commands a room, but the kind that commands a soul. When she stepped into the car, waiting to take her to the Waldorf, she felt the subtle tremor of change beneath her feet. The city around her glittered in morning light, unaware that one of its women had just chosen to resurrect herself. Naomi didn't look back at the building as the driver pulled away. The choice had already been made, and choices, once made in truth, do not require witness. Ahead, the day opened like a door, and Naomi walked through it, steady, whole, and newly born. The evening ripened the way a sonata does, measured, inevitable, aching toward its first crescendo. Outside the Waldorf, the April air wore a faint memory of rain. Inside, light gathered in generous pools beneath the chandeliers, the way affection gathers around a child about to speak. Velvet ropes and velvet voices, the low cinema of arrival, names called, laughter polished, the small theater of introductions performing itself to perfection. Naomi stepped from the car as if the ground had been expecting her. The ivory gown she had chosen traced her like an idea finally certain of itself. Neither loud nor shy, simply true. Pearls nested at her throat, their glow intimate, as though they had decided to be moons only for her. A wind moved, the skirt answered. She lifted her chin and the flashbulbs softened, as if the room remembered its manners. "Dr. Brooks, just a moment. Over the shoulder, please." She obliged lightly, turning with the unhurried grace of someone who knows the difference between being seen and being watched. Behind her, the city carried on. Cabs shouldering their way through light, a saxophone somewhere finding its second breath. In front of her, the gala waited, warm as a reading lamp, bright as a vow. Timing is a language most people never learn. Naomi was fluent. She crossed the foyer exactly when the orchestra shifted from prelude to invitation. Staff in black moved like capable shadows. A volunteer adjusted a place card. Naomi touched the young woman's wrist, a thank you placed where it could be felt. She greeted board members by name and asked after particulars no one expected her to remember. A father's recovery, a son's piano jury, the way a new baby had slept last night. Presence, she understood, is a kind of philanthropy. The ballroom unfolded in size of gold. Paper cranes, folded by students from all 5 boroughs, perched among magnolia and orchid, small white witnesses to a city's meticulous hope. A string quartet braided Gershwin with the murmur of silverware. On the dais, a lectern waited beneath a spill of light, precisely tall enough to bless and not blind. She felt it then, the room's alertness bending, not to her, but toward the staircase. Heads tilted, the crowd parted a little. That delicate choreography human beings perform when they sense the plot arriving. Naomi turned, not quickly. She had learned long ago that the difference between flinching and looking is dignity. There he was, one hand on the banister, the other accommodating the touch of a woman on his sleeve. Ethan, handsome as an advertisement for faith in the future, descended 2 steps, paused, allowed the cameras to harvest what they could. Lena Hart's dress was green, the color of intention, a shade that asked to be believed. Around her wrist, she wore a diamond bracelet whose clasp Naomi knew intimately, not because it was expensive, but because Ethan had fumbled with it once by lamplight in the old apartment, both of them laughing, the night insisting on staying. A ripple of whispers moved through the room like a seam being tugged. Some faces performed surprise, others performed nothing at all, which is its own performance. Naomi felt the floor beneath her, a steady, patient instrument. Hold. She did not search Ethan's eyes across the distance, did not offer the sorrow of seeking a signal. She lifted her glass in a gesture so small it could have been for anyone, a glint of acknowledgement, the kind merciful hosts extend to latecomers who have forgotten their own decorum. Then she turned back to the donor at her side, a retired principal who had ferried more children toward themselves than any budget had ever planned for. "You look luminous," the principal whispered, squeezing Naomi's hand, not as compliment, but as benediction. "So do they, Naomi said, nodding toward the table where 3 students sat, wide-eyed and trying to pretend they weren't. She moved through the ballroom, the way a clear river moves around stones, neither resisting nor rushing. She introduced the poet to the commissioner to the dancer to a philanthropist whose generosity always improved after 2 sips of champagne. Here and there she felt glances land and lift, questions suspended midair like cut glass. Is she all right? Does she know? Will she break? Their curiosity was a small weather, noisy and brief. She preferred larger climates. At a table near the front, Ethan laughed a little too loudly. Naomi didn't measure his volume. She measured the silences that gathered quickly after it, the way seasoned donors turned their attention to napkins, to water glasses, to the program they had already read. Old money has an instinct for infractions the law does not recognize. They didn't look at Naomi out of pity. They looked at Ethan as one looks at a man who has forgotten the rules of a house that was kind enough to invite him. When the quartet paused between movements, Naomi crossed to the edge of the stage to confer with the MC. 2 minutes, she murmured, and the MC, a man whose career was built on sounding spontaneous, exhaled relief. She checked the teleprompter, then closed it with a fingertip. She knew her words by heart. Her heart, tonight, was in very good order. A student approached then, the smallest of the 3, dark braids tied with ribbon, shoes too new. "Dr. Brooks," she said barely above the music, "my mom says to tell you thank you for the art class. I made a bird that actually looks like a bird." Naomi crouched so their eyes could meet without strain. "I knew you would," she said. "Could you show me which one is yours?" The girl pointed toward a crane nestled near a candle, its wings tilted as if listening. "I made the beak too long," she confessed, mortified by the fraudulence only children and artists can feel. "Perfect," Naomi said. "That's where the story lives." She rose. Across the room, the staircase gleamed like a stage that had forgotten its actors. She thought, fleetingly, of rehearsal studios in which dancers breathe together in darkness just before the lights find them. How that breath feels like the world making room. An old calm opened in her. Not triumph, not even courage, something quieter. Permission. Carmen appeared at her shoulder, a glass in hand. "You're incandescent," she said. "Incandescent is for light bulbs," Naomi replied, amused. "I'll take steady." "And generous," Carmen added, her gaze flicking, not quite toward the staircase, but toward the idea of it. Generous is useful, Naomi said. It keeps the room from shrinking. The orchestra shifted keys. The MC moved toward the microphone, his smile calibrated to sincerity. A hush gathered, expectation braided with curiosity, curiosity braided with relief. The moment when people are most beautiful because they are ready to listen. Naomi felt the weight of the bracelet across the room like a weather front. She did not resent the woman wearing it. The bracelet, like most bright things, had mistaken motion for meaning. She was done with mistaking. She set her glass down, touched the top card on the lectern as a pianist touches a single key to greet the instrument, and drew a slow, unremarkable breath. Above her, the nearest chandelier trembled in its own light. Paper cranes held the air between their wings. A city full of other rooms went on loving and breaking in thousands of private languages. Here, in this one room, the night aligned. The masks were beautiful, hers crafted of dignity, theirs of bravado, the crowds of ritual. But masks, she knew, were not lies. They were tools. You wear them to protect what you love until you can bring it safely into the light. The MC spoke her name. The room turned as one body. Naomi stepped forward, not toward spectacle, but toward the place where truth waits to be spoken gently enough to be heard. For a breath, the room was all stillness. 500 conversations suspended midair. 500 glances turned toward a single figure beneath the chandeliers. Naomi felt the hush settle on her shoulders like a silk cloak. She didn't shrink beneath it. She inhabited it. Silence, she knew, could be a crown when worn with grace. The MC's final words dissolved into applause, gentle but anticipatory. Naomi moved toward the podium, her heels whispering against the marble. The spotlight followed, wrapping her in a soft, golden geometry. Behind her, the orchestra's instruments lowered as if bowing in deference. Ahead, a sea of faces waited, philanthropists, officials, artists, students, people who had come for charity, but would leave having witnessed something far rarer. Conviction made luminous. She rested her hands lightly on the edges of the lectern. No notes, no teleprompter. Her preparation had never been about memorizing lines. It had been about remembering purpose. Her voice, when it came, was calm and low, but carried effortlessly through the ballroom. "Good evening," she began. "When I first imagined this event years ago, I thought it would be about celebration, about talent, about generosity, about what happens when we give the next generation the tools to create. But I've come to understand that nights like this aren't only celebrations. They're reminders of how fragile and how powerful creation truly is." A pause, the kind that lets truth breathe. There are children in this city who find their courage in color, their solace in rhythm, their hope in the shape of a word. They create because creation is the opposite of disappearance. And when we fund their voices, we aren't doing them a favor. We're acknowledging their belonging. We're telling them, "You are seen. You are necessary." Her tone deepened, each word precise, deliberate. Over the past 5 years, this foundation has provided grants to more than 40 programs across New York. We've placed brushes in hands that once clenched with hunger. We've replaced silence with song. We've watched lives turn toward light. Soft applause rippled, the restrained kind that says, "Yes, keep going." Naomi smiled faintly, not as performer, but as witness. "But something else has happened too," she continued. "We've learned that giving doesn't just change the receiver, it transforms the giver. It reshapes how we measure worth. It teaches us that real power doesn't come from what we own or even what we achieve, but from what we build that outlasts us." Across the ballroom, she saw heads tilt, eyes soften. She saw Ethan's posture shift at his table, his smile freeze just enough to reveal unease. She didn't look directly at him, but her words reached him anyway. "There is a temptation," she said, "especially among those of us who have built something visible, to believe that brilliance is a solo act, that legacies are written by one name. But that's never been true. Every creation worth anything, every company, every foundation, every piece of art was born of collaboration. Someone dreamed, yes, but someone else built, someone else sustained. And often, The hands that hold it all together are the ones the world forgets to thank. A murmur passed through the crowd, not discomfort exactly, but recognition. The truth had found its mark. Naomi let it settle. "I want to thank those hands tonight," she went on, her tone tender but edged with steel. "The quiet architects, the ones who make order out of chaos, who lift without applause, who endure without acknowledgement. You are the reason the lights stay on." There was a movement in the back of the room, a spontaneous, unscripted wave of applause that began softly and then swelled until it filled the space. Naomi inclined her head slightly, accepting not the praise, but the understanding behind it. When the sound faded, she leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dropping into intimacy. "I've also learned something else through this work," she said, "that our lives, our real lives, begin the moment we stop asking others for permission to be extraordinary." She felt her heart beat once, strong and certain. Every child we help tonight will face a world eager to define them, to tell them how much of themselves is acceptable, how much of their light the room can handle. But what if we taught them never to dim? What if we taught them that their brilliance isn't negotiable? The words rose, clear and resonant, not loud but luminous. "Legacy," she said softly, "isn't about possessions or titles. It's about courage. The courage to create when it would be easier to imitate. The courage to stand alone when silence is more fashionable. The courage to keep building, even after what you built has been taken from you." Somewhere near the front, Carmen exhaled audibly, her eyes glistening. Naomi glanced toward the student table. The girl with the two long paper crane beaks sat upright, listening with the concentration of someone memorizing a spell. "We are all builders," Naomi said. "The question is only, what will we build? Something fragile, meant for admiration, or something enduring, meant for truth?" The air in the room had changed now. You could feel it, the pulse of shared awareness, the collective hush when people know they are inside a moment they'll remember. Naomi allowed a breath's space before her final words. "Tonight, as we raise our paddles, as we write our checks, as we whisper our bids, remember this. What we give tonight will outlive us, not as marble or money, but as freedom in someone else's hands." The applause began slowly, a tremor, then rose into thunder. People stood, not all at once, but in waves, like fields catching wind. Some faces shone with tears, others with that fragile awe that follows recognition. Naomi stepped back from the lectern, her pulse steady, her expression serene. The orchestra began again, violins swelling, a piano note soft as forgiveness. From where she stood, she could see Ethan at his table, his hands coming together, clapping, his smile practiced and brittle. Lena beside him, motionless, unsure of her place in the ovation. Naomi didn't need to hold their gaze. She had already said everything that mattered without saying a single name. She walked toward her seat through aisles lined with standing guests. Some reached out to touch her arm, a wordless acknowledgement. Others simply nodded, their eyes bright. Naomi accepted each gesture as a quiet benediction. At her table she sat, folded her hands in her lap, and exhaled once, deeply, completely. Around her the applause continued, swelling and fading like the tide. It wasn't triumph she felt. It was reclamation, the quiet power of a woman who had spoken truth so elegantly that the world mistook it for grace. And above the chandeliers, unseen but present, the paper cranes swayed gently, wings catching the air, carrying her words toward whatever horizon awaited next. The city slept with its lights still on, and from her bedroom window, Naomi watched them flicker, amber and white, like the heartbeat of something immense and unaware of its own pulse. The gala had ended hours ago, but its echo remained in her body. The weight of applause, the fragrance of orchids, the sound of her own voice reverberating in memory. On the dressing table lay the remnants of the night, her clutch, a half-empty lipstick, a folded program speckled with fingerprints. The gown, now draped across a chair, shimmered faintly under lamplight, the silk collapsing into the shape of rest. Naomi stood barefoot, one hand wrapped around a glass of water gone warm, the other pressed lightly against her sternum, as if to verify that the rhythm beneath her palm was still hers. She felt neither victory nor sorrow, only the stillness that arrives after a storm has passed. When you realize the house has not fallen, only the illusions inside it. Ethan was still out. He had left early, feigning fatigue, but she knew he'd slipped through the hotel's side entrance to avoid the press. The sight of him with Lena, his arm too familiar, his smile too performative, had been burned into the cameras, and he must have realized, even then, how small it made him look. For a man obsessed with image, that was its own undoing. Naomi walked through the apartment slowly. The night air carried the scent of her perfume mixed with faint traces of champagne. On the kitchen counter, a vase of tulips leaned in surrender, their petals bruising at the edges. She touched one gently, the way one might comfort something that cannot be revived. In the quiet, she let herself remember everything she had withheld during the evening. The tremor of seeing her necklace around another woman's throat, the hum of whispers beneath polite conversation, the steady rhythm of her own breathing as she stood in the spotlight. It had been more than a speech. It had been a reckoning disguised as gratitude. And yet, now that it was done, she did not feel emptied. She felt cleared. She sat at her writing desk, opened a notebook, and began to write. Not to document, but to release. Tonight, the world applauded what it thought was poise, but it was something quieter, the refusal to vanish. I have learned that grace is not submission, it is strategy. And silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it is architecture. The words steadied her. She wrote until the clock whispered past 2, then closed the notebook, her handwriting slanted and alive across the page. When the door opened sometime later, she didn't turn. She heard the familiar shuffle of his shoes, the sigh that always came before he spoke, the sound of guilt rehearsing its lines. "Naomi," Ethan said softly, his voice frayed at the edges. "You're still awake?" She looked over her shoulder. He stood in the doorway, tie loosened, hair disheveled, the faint sheen of a man who'd spent too long pretending everything was fine. "Apparently," she said. He hesitated, searching her face for an expression that would tell him how to proceed. But Naomi's expression was unreadable, a surface calm enough to reflect his own unease. "You were incredible tonight," he tried. "People can't stop talking about your speech." "I imagine they can't," she replied, her tone even. It gave them something to think about. He nodded too quickly, relief flickering like a faulty light. "Exactly. It was powerful and heartfelt. You made me proud." The word "me" lingered between them, swollen with irony. Naomi's gaze returned to the window. "I'm glad the evening served its purpose," she said quietly. Ethan crossed the room, the scent of cologne mingling with exhaustion. "Naomi, if I've seemed distracted lately—" "You have," she interrupted, her voice soft but sharp enough to stop him. "But distraction is not the word I'd use." He blinked, then sighed, his hands falling uselessly at his sides. "I don't want to argue." "Neither do I," she said. "Arguments imply two people still trying to convince each other. We're well past that." Her calmness unsettled him more than anger ever could. He started to speak, stopped, then reached for the nearest surface, the kind of gesture men make when they need a prop for remorse. "I think we just need time," he said finally. "Things have been stressful, that's all. The company's under pressure and—" "Don't," she said gently. "Don't insult both of us by pretending this is about work." The words hung there, soft but immovable. Ethan's mouth closed. For a moment, his face was almost boyish in its confusion, as though he couldn't quite locate the point where control had slipped away. Naomi rose, her movements unhurried. "You should get some sleep," she said. "It's late." He opened his mouth again, but whatever apology he had prepared died before it reached air. He nodded, walked toward the bedroom, and closed the door. When the latch clicked, Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't sadness that filled her then. It was certainty, the kind that feels like a horizon slowly coming into focus after years of fog. She turned off the lights and let the apartment sink into darkness. The city still glowed outside, a reminder that beauty and cruelty could coexist in the same skyline. She leaned against the glass, forehead resting on the cool surface. Somewhere below, traffic whispered, a lullaby for the restless. The woman in the reflection no longer looked like someone waiting to be chosen. She looked like someone preparing to choose. The morning came, with pale sunlight spilling through sheer curtains. Naomi moved through the motions of her routine. Coffee, emails, a brief call with the foundation's treasurer. The night before lingered, but not like a wound, more like a scar, clean-edged, closing neatly. At noon, she met Carmen for lunch at a small restaurant on Madison Avenue. Carmen's eyes, always too perceptive, softened when she saw her. "You did it," she said simply. Naomi smiled. "I did. And now?" "Now," Naomi said, stirring her tea. "I finish what I started." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Carmen reached across the table, covered Naomi's hand with hers, and nodded once, the gesture of one woman recognizing another's resolve. Later, when Naomi returned home, the apartment was quiet again. Ethan had gone to the office. On the counter sat a note, 2 lines scrawled in haste. "Dinner tonight? Just us." She folded the note once and set it aside. She already knew the answer. That evening, as twilight slid over the city like silk, Naomi stood before the mirror, brushing her hair slowly. The woman looking back at her was both familiar and new, softer perhaps, but sharper too, like light refracted through a clearer lens. It was the night after everything, and yet it was also the night before something else entirely. Outside, the world glittered as it always had. Inside, Naomi Brooks took her first breath of freedom, and it tasted like truth. Morning arrived with the tact of a well-bred guest, soft-footed, pale, considerate of the hours that had come before. Naomi woke to a city rinsed in gentle light, the kind that makes everything look newly possible. She lay for a moment beneath the linen's cool hush and listened to the faraway hum of New York setting out its wares, sirens reduced to threads, a delivery truck's sigh, pigeons debating a cornice as if it were policy. On the kitchen counter, the newspaper waited with a ribbon of headlines about the gala. A columnist had called her speech a lesson in luminous authority. Another had written that the evening belonged to a woman who turned grace into grammar and taught a room to conjugate its conscience. Naomi read without pleasure and without disdain. Praise was weather. She had learned to keep a coat near the door. She set a cup beneath the espresso machine and watched the dark ribbon of coffee gather itself. Beside the mug lay a pale folder with a quiet name, Threshold, and tucked within it, the documents Danielle had dispatched at dawn, precise as an orchestra tuning to the same note. Numbers, dates, memos, screenshots, letters of engagement, drafts of branding manifestos in Naomi's hand, from years when Sintrack had lived on adrenaline and faith. None of it dramatic, all of it true. Ethan's key turned in the lock. He entered with the disheveled cheer of a man who believes all damage can be repaired with charm. "Morning," he said, a shade too brightly. "I grabbed croissants. From the place you like on Franklin." "Thank you," Naomi replied, and poured a second cup. He watched her for a moment, bewildered by the absence of weather on her face. "You were extraordinary last night," he offered. "The coverages, my God, Naomi, it's everywhere." She slid the second cup toward him, then closed the folder with 2 fingers as if to keep the papers warm. "We'll need the coverage," she said, almost absently. "It makes certain conversations simpler." He blinked. "What conversations?" "The kind that prefer clarity." She gestured to the table. They sat. The apartment was briefly a church, the light, the spare altar of the marble, the sacraments of coffee and paper. Naomi folded her hands, and when she lifted her gaze, it was not to accuse, but to witness. "I'm filing for divorce," she said. The sentence entered the room and took its seat where a future used to be. Ethan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Naomi," he said, as if the name might reverse time. This is sudden." "No," she said gently, "it's punctual." He laughed then, the small, frightened laugh that men deploy when reality refuses to negotiate. "We've been under pressure. I've been under pressure. Things got blurred, but we can fix this." "This isn't a smudge," Naomi said. "It's a pattern." He reached for her hand and found only air. "Whatever you think you know." She slid the folder across the table. "I don't think. I know." She spoke without edge, each word placed as carefully as porcelain. "What's in there isn't a story. It's a timeline. Travel, charges, photographs, messages. Also an inventory of my contributions to Syntrack, early strategy documents, investor introductions, the brand architecture you still use verbatim. My name may be missing from the articles, but it isn't missing from the work. He stared at the folder as though it contained a spell. Who put this together? I did, Naomi said, and an attorney who understands both numbers and women. Danielle Pierce will contact you this afternoon. His face shifted, first to outrage, then to reason, then to the tender panic of a man who can feel the floor learning to be a door. This is cruel, he said quietly. Whatever happened, whatever you think I did, ending us like this is... She held up a hand. Ethan, she said, and his name was a benediction and a boundary. I am not ending us in a panic. I am concluding us with proof. He stood, paced to the window and back. So that's it? 12 years, discarded because I made a mistake? Mistake, Naomi repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. A mistake is a misdialed number. A mistake is forgetting a birthday and remembering while there's still time to bake a cake. What you did was a sequence. You chose it repeatedly. You choreographed it. You walked a woman into a room I built and dressed her in a gift you once fumbled onto my wrist by lamplight. You didn't just forget me, Ethan. You erased me in public. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, a softer weapon appeared. I love you, he said. I know I haven't shown it well, but I can do better. We can... Love, she said not unkindly, is a verb. You conjugated it in past tense. Silence widened, not with threat but with clarity. Outside, a siren threaded the morning and withdrew. Ethan returned to his chair as if gravity had been renegotiated without him. What do you want? He asked finally, the question men ask when they have learned that wanting is no longer their exclusive privilege. Peace, Naomi said. Equity. Recognition of labor rendered and value created. Discretion. And a settlement that reflects the truth of how Syntrack became investable. She tapped the folder's corner. The documents make the argument. I don't have to. He swallowed. You'd burn the company down to... No, Naomi said. That's your fantasy of my vengeance. I built too much of the scaffolding to take pleasure in arson. I want it to stand. I simply won't remain its invisible beam. He stared at her as men stare at weather they can't explain. Awe bordered by resentment. Admiration bordered by fear. You've changed, he whispered. No, she answered. I've resumed. The espresso machine clicked as some small function completed itself. Naomi rose and rinsed her cup. The ordinary sound of water against porcelain steadied the room. I'll pack a bag, she said. I'll be at the Gramercy for a few nights while we begin. There's no need for spectacle. I've arranged for a car at 2. You're leaving today? His voice climbed, boyish, then fell. Where will you go after that? Home, she said simply, and let the word define itself later. He reached for her again, not with hands this time, but with memory. Do you remember the lamp? In the basement? The honey light? You brought it the day the landlord turned off the fluorescent and everything felt possible. I have never forgotten that. I'm not asking you to forget, she said. I'm asking you to concede what followed. He nodded, a small movement with the weight of surrender disguised as comprehension. Is there anything I can say that changes this? No, Naomi replied, but there are many things you can refrain from saying that will keep it dignified. A brittle smile flickered and died. He looked at the folder again, then at the window, then at the woman who had just, with exquisite mercy, removed him from the center of a story she continued to elevate. The clock found the hour. Naomi disappeared down the hall and returned with a suitcase, small, deliberate, zipped the way resolve is zipped. She set her keys in the bowl by the door, the sound a single chime. At the threshold she paused. One more thing, she said, her voice a low instrument tuned to kindness. You will be tempted to narrate this in public as my overreaction to your indiscretion. Don't. It's beneath the man I met and injurious to the company we built. Speak of me as you would wish to be remembered by the person who knows where the bones are buried and refuses to dig. He flinched, then, to his credit, he nodded. You have my word. Good, she said. I kept mine for a very long time. She lifted the handle of the suitcase. The door opened with the small sigh of wood that has been asked for years, to hold two lives and is suddenly relieved to hold one. Naomi stepped into the hallway. The air smelled faintly of polish and tulips and the future. Behind her, the apartment remained what it had always been, a beautiful container. To whom it would belong and what story it would tell later was no longer her problem to solve. The elevator arrived. As the doors drew together, she caught a last slice of the kitchen, the cup, the croissant bag, the pale folder on the table like a quiet verdict. Then metal met metal, and the city rose to meet her, as if it had been waiting at this very hour to begin again. The Gramercy room received her with the tact a good room should have, uninterested in the story that brought her, willing to be merely clean air and a bed that held. Naomi set the suitcase against a chair and did not unzip it for a while. She stood at the window and watched the square below hold its own small parliament of trees. The late afternoon was the color of cooled brass. People moved through it with errands disguised as journeys. She turned at last to the work she trusted. From the outer pocket, she drew a slim folder, a fountain pen, her notebook. She wrote the day's date in a tidy hand, and beneath it, 3 lines. I am safe. I am precise. I am new and very old at once. The room approved in silence. That first evening was unadorned. She ordered a bowl of soup she didn't finish, answered 2 emails she'd promised, and placed a call to her mother that lasted exactly as long as both women needed, no more. I'm proud of your spine, her mother said like a blessing. And your softness, she added like another. Naomi hung up and let herself weep, not the operatic grief of betrayal, but the quiet overflow of a vessel that has been upright too long. Morning made its polite entrance. Naomi rose before it could finish and walked south on Park, east toward the river. She crossed streets as light changed, obedient to the choreography of a city that would not pause for anyone's heart. When she reached water, she stopped. The East River wore its usual expression of mild impatience, ferrying light and refuse with equal commitment. She leaned on the railing and practiced the first of the day's disciplines. I will not mythologize what hurt me. I will not vilify what I once loved. She repeated it until her breath remembered. By 9, she was in Danielle Pierce's office, a place constructed for truth to travel without ornament. They reviewed the filings, they reviewed the calendar, they reviewed the ways men try to bargain with the tide. Danielle's language remained exactly what Naomi needed, legal without cruelty, firm without theater. We'll proceed as if they'll be reasonable, she said, eyes kind and unsentimental, and prepared for when they are not. Naomi nodded. Preparation had been her dialect long before this. Over the next days, she began to draft the new life, not as a manifesto, but as a series of small correctives. She toured apartments with high windows and plain floors, spaces that asked so little of the eye and so much of the imagination. Brokers chattered square footage and amenities. Naomi listened for light. In Dumbo, she found it, a corner place on a higher floor, the river framed like a painting that insisted on breathing. The walls were primed a thoughtful white. The rooms kept their own counsel. She signed the lease with a calm that surprised her and scheduled movers for the following week. What she would take, she decided, must pass a test no court could administer. Did it precede him? Did it belong to her labor or her longing? The lamp from the basement years went into the yes pile. The dining chairs he had chosen because they looked like decisions stayed. She wrapped her grandmother's mixing bowl in brown paper as if tucking an elder in for travel. The diamond bracelet, the one she had once worn like a sentence finished, she left on the marble counter with a note. Return to original owner. Narrative misapplied. Between these practicalities, the world went on asking for what she had always given. The foundation called. A school in Queens had lost its dance space to a plumbing disaster. Take ours, Naomi said without checking the calendar, and 24 hours later, a room with mirrors and bar stood ready in Midtown, borrowed through 3 favors, and a memory of a favor before that. A reporter requested a follow-up interview on the gala. Naomi declined with thanks. There are days when a story must be allowed to cool. Carmen arrived one afternoon with flowers that smelled like heat and a bag of something excellent and unnecessary. They ate on the carpet of the new place, legs folded, boxes serving as table and footstool and future. "You look taller," Carmen said finally. "I moved the furniture in my chest," Naomi replied, and they laughed the kind of laugh that lets breath in where caution used to stand guard. The first night she slept in Brooklyn, the city delivered the ordinary chorus, pipes clearing their throats, the elevator's considerate sigh, a neighbor's laugh settling into quiet. Naomi lay awake longer than she intended, composing a prayer not to an outside ear but to the room itself. "I'm not here to perform worth," she told the dark. "I'm here to live it." The room accepted the terms. In hours unclises, she tended small rituals, those domestic sacraments that make a life legible to its keeper. Fresh flowers on Mondays. Windows washed the first Friday of each month. Letters, actual paper, actual ink, to 3 girls from the foundation whose courage had surprised her during portfolio reviews. She wrote about failure as material, rejection as rehearsal, talent as the least interesting part of success. She did not mention Ethan. Their curriculum did not require him. He called, of course, once, twice, then by counsel through Danielle. His first message, contrite and ornate, translated roughly to, "Reverse, please." The second went quiet at the edges, where rage meets auditioned humility. Naomi responded to none of it. She allowed the professionals to speak in their professional idiom, while she practiced a vocabulary she had neglected. Rest, refusal, return. On a late afternoon that had the color of tea left too long, she uncrated the lamp and placed it on a slender table near the window. When its honey light rose and met the river's pewter, something in her clicked into its correct alignment. She brewed coffee and stood with the mug warming both hands, remembering the first time this lamp had made an unbeautiful room gentle. It did not make the space important, it made it possible. She understood that about herself now. A text from her mother arrived. "Made stew. Come Sunday?" Naomi smiled, typed yes, and could almost taste the time already. When the movers returned for the final items, the Tribeca apartment looked staged for a brochure, elegant and untrue. Naomi walked through the rooms one last time, letting each hold her for a breath and release. In the bedroom, she opened the closet and removed from a high shelf a shoebox she hadn't opened in years. Inside lay old programs, napkins with ideas written crookedly, a faded photograph of 2 people stunned by the idea of love. She did not throw it away. She did not take it. She left it where it belonged, in a place that would soon belong to someone else. On her way out, she placed the keys in the bowl, their small metal clink an epilogue. The doorman, who knew and didn't, tipped his cap with the courtesy of a man guarding both doors and dignity. The car door shut with an affirming thud. The city unrolled. Back in Brooklyn, the sun let itself down over water with a restraint she admired. Naomi opened the window and invited evening in. She set a single plate on the counter, sliced a peach, sprinkled it with salt the way her grandmother had taught her, and ate standing up, juice on wrist, laughter sudden and unbidden. Alone is not a synonym for empty, she thought. Alone is a room with the exact number of names it can hold. She turned the lamps dimmer to a tenderness that made even the boxes look intentional. Then she did the smallest, bravest thing a person can do after unmaking a life. She put on music and swayed, barefoot, from sink to window, from window to door. The dance of a woman reacquainting herself with the square footage of her own body. Outside, the river kept its unending appointment with the sea. Inside, Naomi Brooks kept hers with a self she had always been building toward, quietly radiant, entirely her own. The morning arrived unannounced, a pale shawl of light drawn across the river and the brick in the glass. Naomi woke before it had the courage to brighten, and for a long moment lay still, listening to her new apartment learn her. Pipes cleared their throats with the modesty of old men. Somewhere below, a bicycle bell chimed twice. Yes, yes, then disappeared into the day. She smiled at the ceiling, a private treaty signed between body and world. Her phone vibrated once. Coffee? Urgent news. Carmen. They met at a narrow cafe in Fort Greene, where plants ran wild over shelves and conversation came in low currents. Carmen was already there, cheeks lit with the kind of excitement that refuses to sit down. She slid a folder across the table the way one offers a ring. "Aurora," she said, A fund for women founders, majority Black and Latina-led. I have anchors ready. I have rooms to walk into. I need a co-director who can see around corners and make the rest of us believe the corner is a door. Naomi turned the folder. A moon-pale A blossomed on the cover. Simple and certain. Inside, term sheets, letters of intent, a list of commitments written in ink that looked both confident and cautious. She read quickly, then once again as if tasting. And you, Carmen added softer, I want you to be the weather this fund grows under. Naomi looked out the window at the street where two girls in school uniforms shared a pair of wired earbuds, bobbing in tandem to a music only they could hear. She felt the old current, purpose, rise like tide. Yes, she said, not a performance, a fact arriving. They found the office 3 days later. A former photography studio in a Clinton Hill brownstone, its bones still smelling faintly of developer and sun. Exposed beams, a wall of north light, a sliver of rooftop where a table could hold 4 coffees and a revolution. Naomi stood in the doorway and felt the air tilt toward them, as if rooms too could recognize their people. They painted the walls a patient white and moved in a long table scarred with history. On the first morning, Naomi set a small vase of stock in the center, her grandmother's flower, spicy and clean, a reminder that beauty could be both delicate and durable. She brought the honeyed lamp and placed it on a file cabinet where it made even spreadsheets look like choreography. Work began, not with noise but with listening. Founders came in pairs and singles, with decks and prototypes and the unguarded urgency of people who had no time for myth. A nurse from the Bronx with a telehealth platform designed between shifts. A former public school teacher building a literacy app that turned bus rides into lessons. An electrical engineer from El Paso, developing cooling materials for buildings that could no longer pretend summers were reasonable. They were beautiful in the way competence is beautiful. Shoulders squared by use, language sharpened by having to translate brilliance for rooms that doubted it. Naomi listened the way surgeons listen, for the steady rhythm beneath the worry, for the organ that wanted to live. She asked questions that rearranged the map. What does your customer do 5 minutes before they need you? What breaks if you grow twice as fast as planned? What do you know that the market is too tired to know yet? She drew on windows, circled verbs, crossed out apologies. When a founder faltered, she lent the room her breath. You could see relief move through shoulders like a thaw. Money followed courage. Aurora's first close exceeded their target by a whisper that felt like a shout. The press called, polite and expectant. Naomi answered with 3 sentences and declined profiles that tried to turn her into a moral of the story. She preferred nouns, capital, companies, jobs. The days took on a choreography that nourished her. Mornings began with a walk along the river and a page of handwriting, ink steadying thought. Midday came with deals, diligence calls that were less interrogation than invitation, a whiteboard full of sketches that looked like constellations trying to decide who to become. Evenings were for quiet domestic rites, sheet pans with roasted peaches, a book read standing, windows open to a hum that felt like belonging. There were stumbles, of course. A founder she adored couldn't recruit a CTO fast enough and missed her window. Another tried to build too many features before proving the first one held. Naomi did not scold. She reset the metronome. Iterate like breathing, she said gently. Inhale, exhale. Don't hold your breath because someone is watching. Letters began to arrive, some typed, some handwritten, in loops that leaned forward as if to say, forgive the haste. I needed to tell you this now. A girl from the foundation sent a photo of a scholarship letter, her smile so large it crowded the page. A retired teacher wrote to say she had invested a portion of her pension in Aurora's mission because she wanted to grade a different kind of paper. Naomi kept these in a drawer labeled Oxygen. One afternoon, a storm rehearsed itself over Brooklyn. Lightning that never quite signed its name. Rain undecided. In the half-dark of the office, a founder named Lila pitched an API for community clinics. Halfway through, her laptop died. The room paused, the way a room pauses when it is deciding whether to be kind. Tell me without the slides, Naomi said. Lila did. She spoke about her grandmother's blood sugar, about bus routes and work schedules, and how care gets rationed to those who need it most. She spoke about code like a dialect of mercy. By the time power returned, the deal had already been made, not on paper, but in the air between witness and will. At night, Naomi sometimes stood on her small balcony and let the city perform its endless monologue. She thought of the woman she had been in the loft across the river, deft, devoted, dimming herself to keep the stage even. She did not despise that woman. She thanked her for her labor and invited her to rest. Ethan's name appeared less and less in her mind, not from effort, but from lack of utility. Occasionally, a friend would say he'd been on a panel and looked thin around the eyes. Naomi would nod, the way one nods when told weather has passed over a town you used to live in. She felt nothing that resembled triumph, only the small mercy of irrelevance. On a Sunday at her mother's, the stew was exactly as she remembered. Time at the hinge of every bite, tenderness rendered into flavor. They ate at the kitchen table that had hosted 1,000 arguments and 1,000 more reconciliations. After, her mother pressed a jar of peaches into her hands and said, "Store sweetness. Don't chase it." Back at home, Naomi placed the jar on the shelf and rearranged her books by how much they had saved her. She put the lamp on low and lay on the rug, looking up as if the ceiling were a sky she had finally earned. There was no applause in this room, no audience, no lesson insisting on being taught. There was only breath and the faint scent of stock, and the knowledge that work done in the right direction makes a kind of music a person can live inside. The next morning, Aurora signed its 5th term sheet. Carmen danced with a pen between her teeth. Naomi laughed and bit the end of a ribbon to tie around the founder's bouquet. The office door was propped open to the hall, and passers-by could hear a hum that might have been the printer, might have been the future, might have been 2 women tuning the city to a kinder key. In the evening, Naomi walked home under a sky the color of polished slate. She stopped at the bodega for limes, at the florist for eucalyptus that would make the apartment smell like rain. When she reached her building, the neighbor's dog wagged its whole rear half at her as if to affirm she belonged. She climbed the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator, feeling legs and lungs do their old, honest work. Inside, she sliced the limes, set water to boil, and stood at the window as dusk unbuttoned the day. It was not happiness she felt exactly. Happiness is weather, bright, passing, notable. What arrived in her chest was climate, temperate, reliable, a season she could plant into. She turned off the kitchen light and watched her own reflection fold into the night beyond the glass. For once, she did not narrate. She simply stood in the quiet house of herself and let the room agree. It began as a murmur that learned to speak, a profile here, measured, precise, unwilling to trade nuance for narrative, a panel invitation there. "We're building a series on capital and care. Would you join us?" Then the photographs. Naomi at a long table, sleeves rolled, a notebook open to the middle, eyes not on the camera but on the woman across from her who was explaining a dream as if it were architecture. The city loves a resurrection. It adores most the kind that declines to perform itself. On a gray Tuesday, she found herself in a studio washed in careful light. The host was the kind who treated conversation like a string quartet, letting themes return, refusing to interrupt the solo. "You've resisted the personal angle," he said at last, gently. "Isn't your story part of what gives founders courage?" Naomi smoothed the page of notes she would not use. "If my history helps a woman recognize herself," she said, "I'm grateful. But courage doesn't require my biography. It requires her belief. I'm here for that." A pause. The producer behind the glass made a small circle in the air with his finger. "Keep going." Naomi did, but not with gossip. She spoke of underwriting risk with empathy, of diligence as an act of respect, of returns measured in jobs and ease and hours returned to a life. When the segment aired, no one could quote a scandal. They quoted sentences that sounded like scaffolding. Articles followed, some greedy for blood she refused to offer, others content to study the machine of her work. One magazine sent a photographer who took a single image and packed up. Naomi leaning against a window, winter light finding the clean geometry of her face, a vase of stock in the corner making its quiet argument for sweetness that endures. The caption did not reach for metaphor. It didn't need to. The photograph did the work of saying, here is a woman who stopped asking for permission to be inevitable. Founders felt the shift first. They arrived at Aurora less hunched against disbelief, more ready to begin. A woman named Priya brought a battery prototype in a canvas tote and left with 3 introductions that turned into a pilot. An educator from Newark sat at the big table, palms flat, explaining curriculum like weather patterns. Naomi listened as one listens to a compass, then said, yes, in a way that made yes sound like infrastructure. The city listened too, with its own chorus of side glances and revised scripts. At an awards dinner meant to honor influence in innovation, a donor leaned toward Naomi between courses and confessed, not unkindly, I used to think you were decorative. Naomi's laugh was sunlight on steel. Many rooms prefer their women as ornaments, she said. I chose doors. Across town, Syntrax stumbled. Not a collapse, something slower, more telling. A tone-deaf campaign. A departure from the product's clean promise into features that mistook difficulty for depth. Engineers left with polite statements that read like escape routes. An op-ed questioned whether the company had lost its original grammar. Naomi read none of it end to end. Reports found their way to her desk anyway, and she placed them face down without ceremony. What needed saving was elsewhere. And yet the past's outline appeared where it pleased. On a conference stage in Midtown, Naomi finished a panel on community-scale tech and stepped into a hallway that smelled of carpet and bravado. At the far end, a cluster of cameras blinked at Ethan as he fielded questions he used to enjoy. He had the look of a man consulting a map for a country that moved while he slept. For a single breath, something like tenderness crossed her. Not for the man, but for the human predicament of confusing applause with oxygen. Then Carmen touched her elbow. A car arrived, and the hallway became a hallway again. The redemption, such as it was, never announced itself with trumpets. It unfolded as a sequence of rooms that received her differently. A bank boardroom where a senior partner, silver hair, immaculate restraint, opened with, "We should have listened sooner." A community center where teenagers showed her an app they'd built to track homework and hunger. When they asked for feedback, she offered questions that returned pride to their shoulders. A gala, another one, new cause, new city, where an MC recited her accolades until she gently intervened. Let's talk about the founders. Their names sound better on a microphone. There were metrics for those who required proof in numbers. Aurora cleared its second close with commitments from institutions that once filed diversity under charity instead of strategy. Portfolio companies crossed milestones. A clinic API live in 3 states, a cooling material licensed to a school district that understood heat as policy. Jobs appeared where statistics had predicted only attrition. Revenue lines learned to lean up and to the right. But for Naomi, the more honest ledger was the drawer labeled oxygen. Letters multiplied. I hired my first employee today and didn't apologize for the salary. Your iterate like breathing is on my wall. I took a sick day without building a case for it first. In the midst of all this, a quiet invitation arrived. No seal, no ceremony. The Contemporary Art Museum asked her to join the board. You listen like a curator, the director said, and you speak like a grant. Naomi accepted because the galleries had been a sanctuary when she was a girl. Cool rooms where wonder was the dress code. On her first afternoon tour, she paused before a canvas that was mostly white, a thickness of paint in one corner, like weather about to decide. Negative space, the docent whispered, as if not to scare it. Naomi smiled. Possibility, she corrected, under her breath. Awards came. She accepted them with the economy of someone who mistrusts trophies and loves plaques only when they name other people's salaries. When the city council honored Aurora, she turned the microphone to 3 founders and stood slightly behind them, out of the photograph's vanishing point. Cameras tried to coax her forward. She refused the choreography gently and let the lens tell the truth. She lifted. They stood. On a late summer evening, Naomi walked home along the water while the sky rehearsed every shade between copper and plum. A poster clung to a bus shelter. One of Aurora's companies had placed its first advertisement. Not boastful, Just an invitation to book an appointment without shame. A woman waiting for the bus read it twice, dialed a number, and smiled into the wind. Naomi felt a bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with self and everything to do with the point. At home, she lit the lamp and stood in the doorway of her small kitchen, listening to the apartment hum. Redemption, she realized, wasn't the reversal of a wound. It was the refusal to let the wound dictate architecture. It was public only because it had become private first. Some interior room ordered so thoroughly that the exterior had no choice but to reflect. Later that week, at a luncheon where the napkins were more ambitious than the speeches, a journalist asked what she would say to the earlier Naomi, the one who made space for everyone else first. "Thank you," she said, "and now rest. I'll take it from here." The room laughed, because rooms need permission to understand grace as instruction. Naomi took a sip of water and turned her face slightly to catch the light, not because the camera wanted it, but because the day did. The city outside went on inventing itself, as cities do. Inside, a woman continued to make of her life a public service. Not a sermon, not a spectacle, but a standard. Autumn had returned to New York with its usual pageantry, trees rehearsing their annual transformation, streets smelling faintly of rain and roasted chestnuts. The air carried that soft melancholy particular to October, the feeling of something ending gracefully so that something else might begin. Naomi had always loved this season. It was the only one honest enough to announce its changes aloud. On a Thursday afternoon, she left the Aurora office early. The day had been full, meetings with founders, calls with investors, a last-minute panel request she declined without guilt. As she stepped out into the street, the wind lifted her hair and loosened something deeper, a kind of nostalgia that arrived without warning. It wasn't for a person or a place. It was for the woman she'd been before everything had broken open, before the fire and the rebuilding. Her phone rang, an unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered. "Naomi Brooks?" The voice was female, tentative, careful. "It's Lena. Lena Hart." The name landed softly, like a feather carrying too much history. Naomi said nothing for a breath. The city roared around her, indifferent witness. "I hope it's okay that I called," Lena continued quickly. "I got your number from Carmen. She said you wouldn't mind." "I don't," Naomi said, her tone measured, almost kind. "What can I do for you?" "I'd like to see you," Lena said, "in person, just to talk. If that's something you could allow." Naomi looked at the traffic light, red against the autumn haze. "All right," she said at last. "Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. The cafe near the park on Lafayette." The next morning, she arrived a few minutes early, as she always did. The cafe smelled of espresso and wet pavement, the kind of scent that carries both exhaustion and comfort. Naomi chose a table by the window. When Lena entered, she looked smaller than Naomi remembered. Still lovely, but stripped of the polish that once shimmered like armor. She wore no makeup, her dark hair pulled back loosely, her expression earnest in a way that suggested she'd rehearsed this meeting in silence many times. "Thank you for seeing me," Lena said, sitting opposite her. Naomi studied her quietly. "You seem well," she said, and though the words were neutral, her tone was not cruel. "I'm better," Lena replied. "Not well yet, but better." They sat in the comfortable awkwardness of two women who had once shared a man, and now shared only the knowledge of what that meant. "I owe you an apology," Lena began, her hands twisting the napkin on the table. "For everything. For what happened. For how it happened. I knew he was married, and I told myself lies to make it sound less terrible. I thought I was different, that I understood him in some special way. But I didn't understand him at all. I didn't understand myself either." Naomi's gaze softened slightly. "Understanding often arrives after the damage," she said. "That doesn't make it useless. It just makes it expensive." Lena's eyes filled. "You were gracious that night. I don't think I'll ever forget it. You could have humiliated me or screamed or—" "I could have," Naomi said, interrupting gently, "but I had nothing left to prove. Anger only feeds the smallness of those who depend on it. I wanted to build something larger than both of you." Lena nodded, swallowing hard. "You did," she whispered. "I've watched what you've built. Aurora, The women you've helped. It's beautiful. Naomi smiled, faintly, as though the compliment had drifted past her. And you? What have you built? The question startled Lena. I'm trying, she said. I've started a small consultancy, brand work for nonprofits. It's modest, but honest. I'm also finishing my MBA. I suppose I'm learning how to build without borrowing from someone else's foundation. Naomi nodded. That's a good lesson. The first architecture of power is self-respect. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the cafe wrapping around them like a neutral witness. Finally, Lena spoke again. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to tell you that you were right, about him, about everything. Naomi stirred her coffee slowly. Forgiveness isn't a performance, she said. It's a weather pattern. You wake up one day and realize the air has changed. The storm has passed, and you didn't even notice when it left. Lena blinked back tears. You're kinder than I deserve. Naomi shook her head. I'm not being kind. I'm being finished. The line landed softly between them. Outside, a child passed by holding his mother's hand, dragging a yellow balloon that kept bumping his shoulder like a loyal friend. Lena followed it with her eyes, smiling faintly. Do you ever think of him? She asked quietly. Not often, Naomi said. When I do, it's as one might think of an earthquake. Terrible, but instructional. The ground I stand on now is stronger because it had to be rebuilt. Lena nodded. He's not doing well. The company. It's not what it was. I think he misses you. Naomi looked at her, steady, unflinching. I don't doubt that. But missing someone and deserving them are separate currencies. For the first time, Lena laughed. A small, helpless laugh that carried both shame and admiration. You have a way of saying things that makes them sound like scripture. Naomi smiled, and the two women shared a silence that felt almost like peace. When they stood to leave, Lena hesitated. Would you ever consider staying in touch? She asked. Naomi considered her carefully, then extended her hand. Let's start with this, she said. A moment of honesty, properly conducted. That's enough for now. Lena nodded, her grip tentative but sincere. Thank you, she whispered. As Lena walked away, Naomi remained at the window, watching her disappear into the soft geometry of morning. The city looked different somehow, gentler, as if it had forgiven itself for something. That evening, Naomi attended a small reception at the art museum. The board was unveiling a new exhibition titled Resilience in Form. She moved through the room slowly, glass in hand, pausing before a sculpture of welded steel that rose like a woman mid-recovery, half ruin, half ascent. Carmen found her there. You look peaceful, she said. I am, Naomi replied. It's strange. Redemption never felt personal, but today it did. Someone from the past? Carmen asked. Naomi smiled. Someone who used to live in it with me. They stood together in quiet admiration of the sculpture. Its welded seams caught the light like veins of gold. Naomi thought it looked exactly like what she had become. Strong, not despite the breaks, but because of them. The evening hummed with polite conversation and clinking glasses. Naomi looked around, at the faces of new allies and old friends, and realized that reunion was not only about meeting someone again. It was about meeting yourself and recognizing, finally, that you had come home. Winter fell softly over the city, the way forgiveness sometimes does, without announcement, without witnesses. Snow gathered along the iron balconies, turned rooftops into pages awaiting a story's last line. From her office window, Naomi watched the flakes drift across the river like slow confetti for an untelevised victory. It had been 2 years since the night of the gala, 2 years since the silence that had followed, since the door that had closed behind her with such quiet finality, it became the sound of her beginning. Aurora had grown into something vast and alive. 60 startups, 3 funds, countless jobs. But the true measure of it lived in moments too small for the financial pages to notice. A founder texting that she'd made payroll for the first time. A team photo full of women who used to doubt they could lead. A school in Detroit that now had computers because one of Aurora's companies had reimagined supply chains. Yet even among all this triumph, Naomi's office remained simple. A desk of reclaimed oak, a wall of books, and the honey-colored lamp that had followed her from basement to penthouse to freedom. Its light was steady now, not defiant but generous. Illumination without spectacle. Carmen entered without knocking, as she always did. "She's here," she said with a grin. "Our newest founder. Nervous as a bird, but brilliant. Should I send her in?" Naomi nodded. "Please." A moment later, a young woman appeared in the doorway, clutching a folder to her chest like armor. Her eyes were wide, bright, a mix of hope and history. Naomi gestured for her to sit. "Your name is Alice?" "Allison," the young woman said quickly. "Allison Hart." The name brushed the air like the echo of something once painful. Naomi's expression didn't change, but her heartbeat did. Just enough to remind her she was still human. "Lena's sister," Allison added softly. "She told me you might see me." Naomi leaned back, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Ah, then you come with a good reference." "I hope so," Allison said. "She said you helped her rebuild her life, that you help women who don't know where to start." Naomi folded her hands. "That's what Aurora does. But tell me, what do you want to build?" Allison opened her folder, and as she began to speak, Naomi listened, not to the pitch, but to the rhythm beneath it, the heartbeat of someone at the edge of transformation. The girl spoke of sustainable housing, of design that respected both people and place, of dignity built into walls and windows. Her words trembled at first, then steadied, then glowed. When she finished, Naomi was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "You remind me of someone I used to be." "Is that good?" Allison asked, smiling nervously. "It's inevitable," Naomi replied. "Every woman I help is a version of the one I once was." She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the river, the same river that had once reflected her heartbreak, now carrying her legacy downstream. "Do you know what I tell all the women who sit where you're sitting?" she asked without turning. "What's that?" "That you already have everything you need. The only permission you've ever been waiting for is your own." When she turned back, Allison's eyes were wet, but her smile was luminous. "Then I'm ready." Naomi reached for the folder and said, "Good, let's begin." That night she walked home through streets washed in the soft gold of shop windows and street lamps. Snow had begun again, finer this time, dissolving on her coat before it could accumulate. As she crossed the bridge, she paused at the midpoint and looked down at the dark water below. Somewhere across the city, Ethan was still running his company, diminished but intact. Lena had built a small firm that served women-led nonprofits. They sent each other cards on holidays now, the kind that say, "Peace to you," without irony. The past had not vanished. It had simply found its rightful size. Naomi exhaled into the cold air, watching her breath curl upward like a benediction. She thought of all the women whose lives had touched hers. Carmen, her fierce ally. Danielle, her legal compass. Her mother, whose voice still guided her choices. And now, Lena's sister, sitting at a desk across town, learning to build instead of beg for space. What an extraordinary thing, Naomi thought, to outgrow the version of yourself that once believed survival was the goal. To wake one day and realize that freedom wasn't a finish line, but an inheritance you had the power to pass on. When she reached her apartment, she poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. The city spread before her like a manuscript in motion. Somewhere below, laughter spilled from a restaurant, and somewhere beyond that, a siren wailed like an unanswered question. She smiled. The world had not changed, but she had, and that was enough to tilt it slightly toward the light. She opened her notebook and wrote a single line. "There are no queens without architects. Build your own crown." Then she set down the pen, closed the book, and let herself simply be. The lamp beside her hummed its low, amber tune. The night felt infinite but tender, full of unfinished stories that might one day find her again. And to you, who have followed her through fire and forgiveness, through ruin and resurrection, Naomi would offer this. When the world forgets your worth, remember it louder. When someone tries to define your place, build another. When love asks you to shrink, answer with growth so radiant it becomes its own language. You do not need to be chosen to begin. You do not need permission to rise. The world waits, quietly, for your design. So step forward, build boldly, create your own light,